Did you know that one of the greatest military commanders in ancient history, the king of the most powerful empire on earth, once ordered his soldiers to whip the sea 300 times, throw chains into the ocean, and shout insults at the water, because a storm had destroyed his bridge, the Hellespont Strait, 480 BC. Xerxes the Great, ruler of the Persian Empire, had spent years building the largest army the ancient world had ever assembled. And then the sea wrecked his plans. His response was not to wait for better weather. It was to punish the water itself. According to the documented historical account of Herodotus, this actually happened. And what followed was even more extraordinary. To understand what drove Xerxes to declare war on a body of water, you first have to understand the weight of what he had inherited. Xerxes I came to the Persian throne in 486 BC as the son of Darius the Great, and along with the throne he inherited the most powerful empire the ancient world had yet produced, and a specific unfinished piece of business. His father Darius had attempted to conquer Greece in 490 BC. The Persian army, far larger and far more experienced than the Greeks they faced, had landed at Marathon, 40 kilometers northeast of Athens. And there, against every expectation, they had been defeated by an Athenian force that charged their lines at a run and broke the Persian formation before it could deploy its superior numbers effectively. The Battle of Marathon sent Darius's invasion force back across the Aegean in humiliation. Darius spent the remaining years of his reign planning a second, larger invasion. He died before he could execute it. Xerxes inherited that plan. He also inherited his father's humiliation, and in the court culture of Achaemenid Persia, where the prestige of the king was the foundation of everything, that humiliation was not a trivial inheritance. It was an obligation. The great king's word had to be vindicated. The great king's power had to be demonstrated as absolute. Greece had to be conquered not merely as a strategic goal, but as a restoration of divine order. Because in the Persian theological framework, the great king ruled by divine right, and his failure was a cosmic disorder that required correction. The invasion Xerxes planned was correspondingly enormous. Ancient sources, including Herodotus, place the total force at numbers that modern historians consider exaggerated. Herodotus suggests figures that would have been logistically impossible to feed, much less to maneuver. But even the most conservative modern estimates place the Persian army at somewhere between 200,000 and 500,000 men. It was, by any measure, the largest military mobilization the ancient world had assembled, and moving it from Asia to Europe required crossing the Hellespont, the narrow strait of water separating the Asian and European continents at what is today the Turkish Dardanelles. The Hellespont is not a wide stretch of water. At its narrowest point, the strait is approximately 2 kilometers wide, less than a mile. On a calm day, an experienced swimmer could cross it, and the ancient Greek hero Leander was said to have swum it regularly to visit his lover Hero on the far bank, guided by the light she kept in her tower. The distance itself was not the challenge. The challenge was the current. The Hellespont is not still water. It is a complex hydrological system where the relatively fresh water of the Black Sea drains into the more saline Mediterranean through the Bosphorus and the Sea of Marmara, creating currents that shift with wind direction and season, run in different directions at different depths, and make navigation significantly more demanding than the strait's width would suggest. A fleet of warships could cross the Hellespont, an army of hundreds of thousands of soldiers, with their horses, supply wagons, and equipment, could not swim across it or cross it in boats in any reasonable time frame. Xerxes' solution was engineering on a scale that was, in 480 BC, genuinely remarkable. He ordered the construction of 2 pontoon bridges, structures made by anchoring hundreds of ships side by side across the strait, lashing them together with enormous ropes woven from papyrus and flax, and then laying a surface of planks, brushwood, and compacted earth across the connected vessels. The surface was substantial enough for horses to walk on without sensing the water below them. The bridges were wide enough for columns of soldiers to march across in organized formation. The engineering challenge was real and significant. The ships had to be positioned precisely to resist the current without being swept sideways. The ropes had to be strong enough to hold the entire structure under the tension of hundreds of anchored ships, while also accommodating the flex of the structure as individual vessels rose and fell with the motion of the water. The surface had to be stable enough that animals and men would not panic and fall into the sea. According to Herodotus, Phoenician and Egyptian engineers, the best in the ancient world for this type of work, were brought in to design and supervise the construction. The first bridge was completed. It was a triumph of ancient engineering, and then the weather changed. The storms of the Hellespont are not gentle. The strait's geography, the way it channels, winds through a narrow passage between the hills of the Gallipoli Peninsula on one side and the Anatolian coast on the other, can produce sudden, violent weather that makes the water dangerous with little warning. Sailors who know the Hellespont respect it. Sailors who do not learn to respect it quickly. The storm that struck the completed first bridges came without warning sufficient for the engineers to take protective action. According to Herodotus's account, which is the primary historical source for all of this, the waves and wind were severe enough that the structure of the first bridges failed completely. The ropes that had been carefully tensioned to hold the ships in alignment were broken or overwhelmed. The ships themselves broke free from their coordinated positions and were scattered. The surface of planks and earth that the army had been preparing to march across was destroyed. When Xerxes arrived at the waterside and saw the wreckage of his bridges, he was looking at more than a construction failure. He was looking at a delay that would affect his entire campaign timetable, at enormous logistical cost and wasted preparation, at the visible humiliation of the world's greatest empire by a stretch of water. The engineers who had built the failed bridges were, by the logic of Persian royal authority, responsible for that humiliation. And Xerxes was a ruler who believed, in a literal and theological sense, that his commands were divine, that his authority extended not merely over men, but over the natural world. The response he chose to this situation is documented in Herodotus's histories with the kind of specific detail that suggests either direct reporting from witnesses or a story so widely circulated in the Greek world that its particulars were well established by the time Herodotus recorded it. Xerxes ordered his soldiers to whip the sea. 300 lashes, applied to the surface of the Hellespont by soldiers wielding the kind of implements used to discipline humans and animals. While the whipping was in progress, Xerxes reportedly had his men shout a specific message at the water, a verbal condemnation that Herodotus records in some detail. The water was told that its master, the king, was punishing it for its transgression. It was bitter water, the message said. The king did not need to sacrifice to it. The king would cross it, whether it wished him to or not. Modern readers typically encounter the story of Xerxes whipping the Hellespont as evidence of royal madness, the behavior of a man so convinced of his own divine status that he had lost touch with reality. But this interpretation, while emotionally satisfying, may not be the most historically accurate reading of what Xerxes was doing. The Persian religious and cosmological framework within which Xerxes operated was not the Greek framework within which Herodotus described it. In the Zoroastrian tradition that shaped Achaemenid Persian theology, water was a sacred element, associated with the goddess Anahita, with purity, with the divine order of the universe. The storm that destroyed the bridges was not, in this framework, a random natural event. It was an act of disorder, a disruption of the cosmic order that the great king was divinely appointed to maintain and enforce. When Xerxes ordered the sea whipped, he was not, or at least not primarily, acting in a fit of frustrated rage. He was performing a ritual act of punishment against a force that had violated divine order by destroying the king's work. He was asserting, in the most concrete physical terms possible, that his authority was not limited to the human world, but extended to the natural world as well. The 300 lashes were not an emotional response. They were a theological statement. Similarly, the throwing of chains into the water, which Herodotus also records, was a symbolic act whose meaning was legible within Persian royal iconography. Chains, in Persian court symbolism, represented the subjugation of enemies to the king's authority. To throw chains into the Hellespont was to symbolically declare the water a conquered enemy, bound to the king's will. It was the same gesture that the king would make after defeating a human enemy. The sea was being treated as a defeated opponent. Whether this interpretation was also, simultaneously, a calculated performance designed to communicate to Xerxes' enormous army that nothing in the world was beyond his authority, not storms, not natural obstacles, not the displeasure of foreign gods, is a question that the historical record does not answer with certainty. But the psychological effect on an army watching their king ceremonially dominate the sea would have been significant. Whatever the theological or psychological calculation behind the punishment of the Hellespont, the engineers who had built the failed bridges had no such rationale available to protect them. In the administrative logic of the Persian imperial court, failure of this magnitude, the failure of a project on which the entire campaign depended, carried out in front of the assembled army, required a response that was proportionate to the shame it had caused. Herodotus records that Xerxes ordered the engineers who had designed and built the first bridges to be executed. Their heads were cut off. The specific number of engineers involved is not recorded, but the implication of the account is that it was a group. The lead designers and supervisors of the failed construction, the people who had been entrusted with the most critical single engineering problem of the campaign. The execution of the engineers accomplished several things simultaneously within the logic of Persian royal authority. It provided a visible, concrete explanation for why the bridges had failed, not because the king's plan was wrong, but because the men executing it were inadequate. It provided a warning to every other engineer, administrator, and commander in Xerxes' enormous army about the consequences of failure. And it cleared the way for a fresh start, a new group of engineers who would approach the problem without the psychological burden of the previous failure and with the extremely powerful motivation of not wanting to share the fate of their predecessors. The effect on the army watching all of this was precisely what such displays of absolute authority were designed to produce. The soldiers who might have wondered, after the storm, whether the campaign was capable of succeeding, whether the sea's opposition was an omen, a divine signal that Greece should not be attacked, were shown something that answered that question definitively. The king had punished the sea. The king had punished the engineers. The king's will would be done. To doubt this was to risk being the next person whose head was separated from their body in front of the assembled army. A new team of engineers was assembled. They had the most powerful possible motivation for success, the most vivid possible example of the cost of failure, and access to whatever resources the Persian imperial economy could provide. The second bridge they designed would not have the vulnerabilities that had destroyed the first. The key engineering innovation in the second bridge design, as described in Herodotus' account, was the alignment of the ships relative to the current. The first bridge appears to have positioned the ships with their length parallel to the direction of crossing, running across the strait, making them vulnerable to being pushed sideways by the current. The second design angled the ships so their hulls faced into the current, using their natural hydrodynamic shape to resist the lateral pressure rather than being overwhelmed by it. The number of vessels used in the second bridge was substantially larger than the first. Herodotus provides specific figures that modern naval historians have analyzed. Approximately 674 warships, combining the heavy trireme warships that were the backbone of ancient naval power with the lighter 50-oared pentaconters. These ships were held in position not only by the anchor lines that had failed in the first bridge, but by a system of additional shore anchorages and cross cables that distributed the tension of the entire structure across multiple redundant attachment points. The ropes themselves were improved. Rather than the papyrus and linen ropes of the first bridge, the second used cables of white flax and papyrus that were woven to significantly greater thickness and tensile strength. According to Herodotus, the completed cables were massive. He provides measurements that suggest individual ropes of enormous diameter, requiring teams of men to move and tension. The surface was designed specifically to prevent the animals from sensing the water below them. Earth was packed onto the planks. Brushwood was laid along the sides of the bridge to create visual barriers that blocked the view of the sea. Horses, whose response to visible water beneath them can be unpredictable, needed to believe they were walking on solid ground. The engineers who designed this detail were thinking about animal psychology as well as structural engineering. The second bridge was completed, and Xerxes, who had punished the sea and the engineers, now chose a different relationship with the water he was about to cross. The shift from violent punishment to ritual propitiation tells us something about how Persian royal ceremony understood the management of powerful forces, whether those forces were human armies, natural phenomena, or divine entities. According to Herodotus, on the morning that the crossing was to begin, Xerxes performed a series of ritual acts at the water's edge. He poured wine into the sea from a golden cup, the same gesture used to make offerings to the divine in Persian religious practice. He threw the golden cup itself into the water, followed by a golden bowl and a Persian sword called an akinax. These objects, valuable, ceremonially significant, Persian imperial in their symbolism, were gifts to the sea. Where 3 days earlier the sea had been beaten and insulted, it was now being honored. The interpretation of this sequence, punishment followed by propitiation, has occupied scholars of ancient Persian, religion and of Herodotus specifically. Some read the punishment as theatrical display and the propitiation as the genuine religious act, with the whipping being primarily for the army's psychological benefit. Others read both acts as sincere, reflecting a Persian theological framework in which powerful natural forces could be both punished for transgression and appeased through offering, not unlike how human subjects of the king could be executed for failure and their successors rewarded for success. What is clear from the Herodotus account is that after the ritual, Xerxes positioned himself where he could watch the entire operation. He had a throne set on a high point overlooking the crossing, a position from which he could see both the bridges and the army moving across them. From this elevated position, he watched as the largest army the ancient world had assembled crossed the Hellespont on 2 artificial bridges. 7 days and 7 nights of continuous movement, the full force of Persian imperial power flowing from Asia to Europe over water that a few days earlier had been whipped for its impertinence. Any serious engagement with the story of Xerxes and the Hellespont has to confront the question of sources honestly, because everything we know about this episode comes ultimately from a single primary source. Herodotus of Halicarnassus, writing his histories approximately 40 years after the events he describes. Herodotus is one of the most important and most debated historians in the Western tradition. His strengths are real and documented. He traveled extensively, interviewed survivors and witnesses, gathered accounts from multiple sides of the conflicts he described, and preserved information that would otherwise have been entirely lost. His histories are the primary, and often the only, source for events of the Persian Wars period, and they are taken seriously by modern scholars as a genuine historical document. His weaknesses are also real and documented. He wrote for a Greek audience in a period when Persia was the enemy, the defeated power, the threatening foreign empire whose expansion had been stopped by Greek valor. His account of Persian behavior consistently emphasizes the arrogance, irrationality, and excess of Persian rulers, exactly the qualities that Greek cultural values defined themselves against. The whipping of the sea is perhaps the single most vivid illustration in his entire work of the concept that Greeks called hubris, the fatal arrogance of those who overreach what is permitted to mortals, who challenge the divine order, and who are subsequently brought down by the gods. Whether Xerxes actually whipped the Hellespont, or whether Herodotus received a distorted account of some symbolic ritual act and rendered it in its most dramatically extreme form, or whether the story was invented or greatly embellished to serve the Greek narrative of Persian arrogance punished by divine justice, these questions cannot be definitively answered from the available evidence. What can be said is that the story was widely believed in the ancient world, that it was repeated and elaborated by later ancient authors, and that it is consistent with what Persian royal inscriptions and other evidence tells us about how Achaemenid kings understood their authority. The crossing of the Hellespont on the completed second bridges was an organizational achievement of genuine magnitude, whatever one thinks of the events that preceded it. Moving an army of hundreds of thousands of soldiers, with their horses, supply wagons, siege equipment, and provisions, across two parallel bridges over an open water channel, maintaining discipline, order, and the logistical coherence of the force throughout, required exactly the kind of administrative and military coordination that the Persian Empire had developed over generations of managing vast territories and diverse peoples. The crossing took 7 days and 7 nights of continuous movement. Day and night the columns moved. The horses walked on ground they could not see through to the water beneath. The soldiers marched without stopping. The coordination required to keep this flow moving, to ensure that the bridges were not simultaneously overloaded in the middle, while waiting at the ends to manage the feeding and watering of hundreds of thousands of men and animals at various points in the crossing, to handle the inevitable accidents and equipment failures without disrupting the overall movement, was a feat of logistical management that deserves recognition independent of all the drama that surrounded it. The Persian army that crossed the Hellespont and entered Europe moved toward Thermopylae, where a small Greek force under the Spartan king Leonidas would hold them for 3 days, a delay whose strategic significance was real even if its legendary status has grown in modern imagination well beyond its historical importance. The Persian army eventually forced the pass, killed Leonidas and his 300 Spartans, and moved on to sack Athens. The Athenians had evacuated. Their fleet at Salamis would eventually defeat the Persian naval force and begin the reversal of the campaign's fortunes. The second Hellespont bridge, as if completing some mythological irony, was reportedly destroyed by a storm when Xerxes was attempting to use it for his retreat. The sea that had been whipped and chained and insulted seemed to have the last word. Xerxes returned to Persia. The Greece he had invaded was not conquered. The empire he governed did not collapse. It remained a major power for another century and a half, until Alexander the Great finally dismantled it. But the Second Persian War represented the high watermark of Persian western expansion. The Hellespont bridges were never rebuilt for a military campaign. The question of Greek independence was settled in the Greek direction. The story of Xerxes and the sea became in the ancient world the canonical illustration of hubris, the Greek concept of overweening human pride that provoked divine punishment. The Hellespont episode appeared in philosophical discussions, in rhetoric, in poetry, across several centuries of ancient writing, always with the same meaning. This is what happens when a king forgets the limits of human authority. This is what pride produces when it reaches the point of punishing natural phenomena for failing to cooperate with human plans. But the story also contains something that the Greek hubris and punishment framework does not fully capture: the reality that the second bridge worked. Xerxes did cross the Hellespont. The largest army the ancient world had assembled did walk from Asia to Europe over water, on a structure that human engineering designed and built. The sea did not, in the end, prevent the crossing. What prevented the conquest of Greece was not the water's revenge but Greek naval tactics, Salamis, and the logistical impossibility of sustaining a massive land campaign through a long Greek winter. The arc of the story: arrogant king punishes sea. Sea eventually defeats campaign. Satisfies the narrative requirements of the hubris lesson that ancient Greeks wanted it to teach. The more complicated reality is that the engineering triumph was real, the logistical achievement was real, and the failure of the campaign had multiple causes that were human rather than natural. Power can cross the sea. It cannot always hold what it reaches once it gets there. The modern visitor to the Dardanelles, the strait that was once the Hellespont, can stand at the edge of the water and look across 1.2 kilometers to the European shore. There is nothing there to indicate that two enormous bridges once spanned this passage, that an army of hundreds of thousands once walked across it, or that a king once had his soldiers whip the water in a fury of royal indignation. The sea, as it has always done, moves regardless of what anyone thinks of it.